Hello, I am Suzanne Hilser-Wiles, President of GG+A. I am joined today by two esteemed colleagues in the field. Rehana Abbas is Chief Philanthropy Officer at the Oakland Museum of California, where she oversees fundraising and membership, including leading the museum's current $85 million campaign. Before joining the Oakland Museum, Rehana served in senior fundraising positions at SF MoMA during its $560 million campaign and at UCSF in the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Abbey Fagin is the Chief Advancement Officer for the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. In addition to being a research library, the Folger presents a robust schedule of performances and exhibitions. Abbey's impressive career includes almost 10 years in development at American University and 3 years as Vice President of Development and Public Affairs at Charles E. Smith Life Communities, where she oversaw fundraising, community engagement, government affairs, and communications for this senior services organization. It has been our great pleasure to work with Rehana and Abbey and their teams, and we are delighted to have both of them with us today. Before we get started, I have a couple of administrative reminders. This will be a 30-minute discussion. We ask that you submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will not be responding during the webinar, but we'll post answers on our website as soon as possible. Finally, you are all on mute during the webinar. And now for our panelists. We know that events and seeing donors around exhibitions and performances are a huge part of cultivation and stewardship in the arts. How is your team adjusting to its cultivation plans to allow for what will be a greatly reduced calendar of these activities over the next 6 months? Rehana, I'm going to ask you to kick us off and begin by telling us a little bit about your program before you actually answer the question.
Sure, thanks Suzanne, and it's nice to be here with you all this morning. So the Oakland Museum of California is a 50-year-old museum that highlights the art, history, and culture of California. We were founded as a museum of the people, and we're really focused on lifting up undertold stories that will inspire all Californians to imagine a brighter future for themselves. And we have a staff of about 140 people. And our program raises about $6.7 million annually in operating support. And as Suzanne mentioned, we are in a comprehensive campaign. So we're in year 5 of our 5-year comprehensive campaign scheduled to end in June 30th, 2021. And to date, we've raised $77 million to our $85 million goal. So regarding events and donor stewardship, one thing that we've found during this time is that we've been able to really partner across the museum with other departments. Before COVID, there was a real clear delineation between a donor and a member event and then a public program. Obviously public programs they were managed out of a different team. Often those events were charged, the marketing and promotion of them were different. But now, since with Zoom webinars, you can really record anything and then release it later, we're thinking more and more about how we might create events that are, maybe live for donors or live for donors and members, and then recorded and released to the public later, or to members, to the general public later. And since donors and members really don't care who's behind the scenes producing the events, they're just, I think, interested in content and hearing about what's happening. We're really kind of partnering across the organization in a really different way than we have before, which is wonderful and something I hope we'll continue to do in the future. And then another thing I'd mentioned that we've been doing, that we just started doing, we did a kind of a coffee and conversation with our executive director. So it was a really casual opportunity for our kind of higher level giving circle to come and hear an update about the museum and then to ask questions. And we're really trying to be as transparent as possible with our donors around where we are right now with our donor communication. And I think that that's gone really well. And so we're planning to do more of those in the future as well.
That's great. Thank you, Rehana. Abbey, would you tell us a little bit about your program at Folger and then also share with us how you are adapting your cultivation and stewardship plans right now?
Certainly. Thank you. Thank you, Suzanne and Rehana. The Folger Shakespeare Library is an 88-year-old institution founded by Henry and Emily Folger as a gift to the American people. Their gift included at its core foundation the world's largest collection of Shakespeare material, the centerpiece of which is the 82 first folios of Shakespeare's printed plays and works dating from 1623. The collection is vast, and at its core, it historically has attracted scholars globally and is a place where one must stop in order to become an expert, not only in Shakespeare, but the early modern world. Naturally, over time, the Folgers, consistent with their vision, wanted to bring that world to life, and so we have many different programs that do so. Perhaps the most relevant here would be Folger Theater, which produces classical Shakespeare plays, Consort, which produces early modern music, poetry program, as well as publishing arms that produce printed works that are probably used by us in high school or our children, as well as scholarly periodicals. We also, and this is something that's come up a lot during the pandemic and home teaching, we also work with networks of tens of thousands of American teachers to assist them in teaching Shakespeare to American middle and high school students. So that's what we do. We have a team of about 12 people and an integrated advancement team, which includes communication and fundraising. The fundraising components obviously are all of the ones that we're used to. We have a $350 million endowment and are at $32.5 million of a $50 million capital campaign that we launched a little over a year ago. I think that another slight distinction would be that we are associated with Amherst College, Mr. Folger's alma mater. And while we have an independent and separate board of governors, they're given their authority by the corporation of Amherst College. A wonderful place to be, and I think that as our capital campaign has at its core, adding a 12,000 square foot new pavilion, so it's a capital project primarily, the objective of which is to bring Shakespeare to life and to really be a center for the discussion of humanities, with the understanding that understanding the past is the key to really surviving in the future and being good citizens. I think that to underscore what Rehana said about the collaboration and breaking down walls with other operating divisions and programming divisions has been absolutely key. One, we are so grateful that they independently and we collectively as a team have unleashed a lot of the Folger resources just for everyone. So whether it's copies of the Folger editions that people can read and download free online, full plays that they can watch, or other treasures from our collection, we have really freed up a lot of resources that were otherwise not necessarily behind a paywall, but things that we just simply did not make generally available. Early on in the pandemic, April 23rd was Shakespeare's birthday, so that gave us an opportunity to do not quite 24 hours, but a 24-hour day of full celebration, bringing in partners from across the globe and well-known personalities, engaging scholars and teachers, and doing fun things as well online, which really brought a lot of energy. Tens of thousands of people participated, and that was something that early on in the pandemic gave us an opportunity to really reveal to our members all the richness that the Folger brings to the table. I think that, just like Rehana said, I think it's some of the things that we've done to highlight membership would be to release things before they were generally available to the public, because we're not an institution that charges membership even when we are open. As a museum in Washington, D.C., that's not a source of revenue for us, for entrance, I mean. So getting things early to members and inviting members to places and spaces that they might not necessarily participate in, such as events that are discussions for scholars, that are really high-level events with academics, or giving them the opportunity to see resources for teachers. And our programming friends have done a great job of creating new opportunities for engagement. I think that in terms of engagement, it's hard not at this moment to comment on the problem with our inability to do the high-level individual face-to-face cultivation. And just like everyone else, we did the check-ins with our donors and prospects, and we've continued to do that. We've paid highest attention to our principal gift prospects that really require high touch, and found new ways to engage them in things that we can send them and links of interest, etc. But I think that little tools would be video walkthroughs that they might not otherwise have access to. We invite them to really individual Zooms. And for some of our donors, these are their first face-to-face Zoom interactions. So we're teaching them those things. But we're doing that and asking permission from donors to continue with these next steps as we introduce them to our resources and keep them up to date. I think that the one final takeaway I would add is that we really quickly realized, as an example, after we started these transitions, that we're not going back to a world that lacks these kinds of engagements. So when we're able to gather again, we will do that, and we'll have wonderful parties that we used to have and gatherings, but we are still going to do this online work because it's critical to maintaining our global access, and it's just a different kind of programming that allows us to have conversations that we wouldn't otherwise have. So I think we recognize that, and we're proceeding as if these are all things that will continue after the pandemic.
Thank you both. And, two things really stuck out to me as you both were talking, particularly, you, as you described, you don't work in institutions that have huge staffs. So I think the fact that your teams were able to work in collaboration and be creative about repurposing things that were already being done, or presenting things that were kind of easily added, is critical to the success here. And Abby, I think your last point is really important. We hear that from a lot of clients that adding not just a kind of you can also join online component to things that we're going to be doing and you feel like a weird spectator from the back of the room, but things that are actually designed to engage people online from across the globe, I think is a wonderful unintended outcome of the programming changes we've had to make, particularly for institutions that are global. And I know you have a global membership, and certainly the reach of Shakespeare is vast. So my second question is really about the crises that this time has highlighted at some institutions, existing crises. So at some places, this includes things like structural deficits, which will require year-over-year gap fundraising. In some institutions, it's legacy programs that we know don't really fit our mission anymore, but we've had a hard time getting rid of. So how is your institution using the opportunity of the crisis to think about the future differently, either financially or programmatically? Abby, let's start with you.
So I should start by saying that we entered this crisis in a very different position than I think most cultural arts institutions. Because of our campaign and our capital project, we had already finished most of our productions, and except for those that were supposed to start this summer and late spring. We had closed our building to the public and stopped exhibitions. And so we already sort of were prepared for this sort of online life. How do we engage people a little bit differently? And also weren't depending at that original point on revenue that we had lost. So that's just an important point to remember. And I think, Suzanne, you opened by using a plural of crises. I want to recognize and acknowledge the crisis that came second, which is certainly related to the killing of George Floyd and the awareness and reckoning that unleashed everywhere, including in our institution. We had already begun that work, because we anticipate opening to broader, more diverse audiences, and wanted to have a sense of abundant welcome when we open our new pavilion to them. So we'd already really begun that work, but I'll focus here on the other kinds of financial crises that the situation has revealed or accelerated for us. First, with regard to programming, we're looking ahead toward an integrated programming model where what's on stage and what's in the exhibition halls and maybe what scholarly projects are all sort of organized in annual themes. And we're hoping that that will be a foundation for increased membership at higher levels in terms of our annual giving society, as well as better corporate and foundation support. And so those are things that we're working on, and we still have that time to continue to work on those. But there are other things that this has accelerated. First and foremost, member benefits. We are in an environment where we can't deliver on most of the member benefits, And those were member benefits that were far too generous to begin with. They obscured for us who was devoted to mission and who just kind of figured out that it came really super close to the performances and plays that I'd like to go to anyway. So what we've done is made a decision that now all memberships will be 100% tax deductible, because we don't think that we can deliver any of the tangible benefits. And if circumstances permit us before we reopen to actually deliver a benefit, we will charge for it. We will test what we think, establishing new limits on invitations, on what membership levels can buy, et cetera. And so that will give us the flexibility that we need to really test the market for a change that we needed to make anyway. Like everyone else, we had a spring gala that was planned in April. And we initially, very early on, moved it to September, and then certainly about a month ago, recognized that it needed to become virtual. That straddled a fiscal year. And so one of the things that gala did, as well as have us understand what's the financial implication for fiscal years and a budget in an environment where budgets are much tighter because our wonderful endowment produced less. It forced us into a level of understanding and a reduction in the buffer that we had in a couple of different areas. So as an example, we did call all of our gala donors and managed to convert probably upwards of 80% of the revenue that otherwise we wouldn't have been able to recognize because the event didn't happen in the year they gave. It will happen in another year. We were able to convert around 80% of their giving. We've also recognized that in a year when the performances that we did have scheduled were coming later, that the way we had written our sponsorship agreements tied up money. It didn't let us recognize income and support productions when it didn't let us recognize income until the productions were actually on stage. So all the work that goes into planning and paying people was tight. So we've had an opportunity to revisit some of our gift agreements with some of those kinds of production-specific events that were pretty important. We're taking a look at our endowment agreements during this time as well. We know that the agreements that we're writing now give the institution the important buffer that it needs and flexibility, but we also recognized that in a year when the budgets were tight and a year where they're going to be tighter, that we were administering our endowments according to tradition rather than according to the paperwork. And it doesn't mean they were in conflict. It meant that our understandings were much more restrictive than the actual donor intent. And that sort of tied up a lot of money, so we were able to do that. Coming back to the gala, I just want to add that I think that we are recognizing that it's unlikely that we'll have a gala in April of 2021. We'll still be closed anyway, and that when we reopen in in late 2022 or early 2023, the world's understanding and comfort level with elite black tie galas is going to be very different. So we're going to take this opportunity to maybe not do those intervening galas that we had planned to do, and to maybe learn from how we can change the revenue model or change the participation model, or at least consider it so that we're more comfortable and it's a much more efficient way to raise money. Lastly, I'd say we had two things. We had a capital campaign challenge grant, and it was at $562,000 when the pandemic and initial stock market reduction hit, and we thought, okay, let's just let all gifts count. We were about to announce that, and then George Floyd was killed, and George Floyd was killed, and we received a significant unrestricted endowment. And our feeling was that it was not the right time to be talking about a capital campaign challenge fund. And so we just decided that we're going to declare victory and go home. So while this challenge grant wasn't something that we wanted to work this way, we wanted it to generate more support for our campaign. It's better to just finish it and allow events to unfold and to relish our success and talk about our success and move on. And my final point is that I referenced our endowment. Early on in this pandemic, when deadlines were approaching for applying for PPP funds and CARES Act funds from NEA and NEH, in our conversations with our peers and cohorts in the arts community in Greater Washington, who were really facing existential crises, and as we're about to put shovels in the ground on a capital campaign project that we're not pulling back on, we really made the decision with board support that we would not apply for those funds, for any of those emergency related funds. Our case was difficult to make. So right now we're just simply threading a needle. And that needle that we're threading is that we rely on your support. We have this great endowment. It does so much, but it's going to be tight. Yet we're still doing this capital project because our future is dependent on it. And we also need your support for that. So these are really tight messages that we have to continue to refine as the situation evolves, but that's kind of where we stand on some of the changes that we've made.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby. And you know, I will point out, since I have the opportunity to know your organizations a little better, I think both the Oakland Museum and Folger Shakespeare Library really have the advantage of having CEOs, having leaders that are very thoughtful about where their institution sits in the cultural landscape and what are the appropriate roles and communications to come from them. And I think, you know, you all are very lucky that that is the case for your institution. So Rehana, talk to us about the Oakland Museum.
Oops, let me unmute myself. Okay, so, you know, as Abby mentioned in the beginning, when she was talking about the Folger, you know, we are in this moment of these two crises. And so COVID is having a financial impact on our institution. Like most museums I've heard are projecting anywhere from a 20 to 30% drop in revenue in the fiscal year coming up, thanks to COVID, and we are kind of in that same boat. We also were operating with a little bit of a structural deficit, and so financially, we knew that at this moment we need to really look at the budget and think about what we can do and how to prioritize where we need to allocate resources, and also staffing. To this moment, we have not, we've been able to retain all of our staff. We haven't furloughed or laid off anyone. We've taken a shared sacrifice model of reducing staff hours. So everyone in the organization has had their hours reduced, except for our executive team, where we've all taken pay reductions. So we've been able to retain everyone, but but we know that that's probably not sustainable. And so, so then thinking about this moment of reckoning in our country around the treatment, the mistreatment of Black people, and this moment of reckoning that's come to light after the murder of George Floyd, we're a museum, the Oakland Museum of California is deeply, deeply committed to racial equity and social justice. And we are actually looked at as a leader in the field in this work. Lori, our executive director, gets asked to write op-eds about this. And so, we are really looked at as a leader. And we're a museum. Museums inherently have a lot of museums, the way we're structured, we're complicit in upholding structural racism and patriarchy. And we're having that moment of internal reckoning at the Oakland Museum of California, like many museums around the country. So we thought, let's take this moment where we're closed and things look a little bit different to really address that. So we've created internally, we decided to take a really kind of what I would call kind of like a radical transparency approach, where any staff member who wants to participate in a process where it's an 8-week process that will really determine our strategic priorities for the next, I'm going to say 1 to 2 years as we sort of move out of this kind of COVID impacted time. Hopefully it won't be longer than that, but then these will also influence the museum, for years to come. And the idea is that by defining strategic priorities, we can then figure out where to best allocate our resources. And typically when we're doing strategic priorities, like a lot of museums, you have leadership coming up with what are these strategic priorities. And that is not equitable. And so we've decided to have anyone on staff who wants to participate. We're calling these staff members have named these groups there as the anti-racist design teams. People are participating in these conversations to talk about what should the Oakland Museum of California actually be doing. We're actually even compensating people for the time, because we're recognizing that this work of strategic planning is not something that's typical in a lot of people's positions. And so we're asking them to step outside of what they would typically be responsible for. And we're taking that seriously by actually compensating people for this time. And so this is really exciting and different, and really helping us think about, like, what does it mean to be a truly anti-racist museum? I'll say from a fundraising perspective, fundraising and philanthropy can be really complicit in upholding past structures. And, you think about, board and power and money. A lot of our organizations, the way development is built, it's upholding structures that are not anti-racist. And so we're really thinking about what does, in our team, we're talking about what does anti-racist philanthropy look like? How does that change benefits? How does that change donor recognition? Do we make decisions that we're not going to accept gifts from certain corporations that fund us because maybe they are benefiting from their prison industrial complex, or maybe they're damaging the environment? These are questions that we're asking ourselves right now. Kind of, where are we today and where do we want to be? Abby was talking about a gala. We actually were supposed to have our 50th anniversary fundraising gala on March 12th, and then we closed the museum on March 14th. Or no, so we were supposed to have it on March 14th, and we closed the museum on March 12th. So we had to very quickly pivot there. But for an organization that's committed to equity, a gala just doesn't feel, it's never really felt like the right fit for our organization in my time here. And so we're looking at this as an opportunity to maybe move away from doing fundraising, relying on a fundraising gala every year, and looking towards more repeatable and reliable ways to generate income. So these are some of the things that we're thinking about that I think will deeply, deeply impact the direction of the organization and how we work together, how we are staffed, how we fundraise for the future of the museum.
Thank you. I'm really struck by the fact that both of you really touched on kind of two big areas that you're looking at. First is the real strategic. How is our mission serving the world that we live in now, and reflecting that? And then also the very tactical, how are we handling things like events and member benefits? And I think we're going to want to have a follow-up conversation with both of you a year from now. So what happened? This has been a very rich conversation. We have time for just one more question. So I'm going to ask you something that actually is a good time. And I'm going to ask you the first one, a good time to how I think you ended your last comment about how philanthropy plays into some of those power structures at institutions. So with earned revenue largely shut down, there's growing pressure on philanthropy. How are you balancing priorities within your own team to maximize those results? And in your case, maybe even in the context of rethinking, how does philanthropy add to the community that we're trying to create at the Oakland Museum? So if you would answer that first, that would be terrific.
Sure. So, for our fiscal 21, which we just started on July 1st, we didn't really, this is just that it's such a hard time to predict what's going to happen. And so we've really kind of taken an approach around budgeting to have kind of a budget envelope that's approved by our board, but we don't necessarily have kind of a line by line, month by month budget the way we normally would. And so in terms of the pressure on philanthropy, I'm really trying to work with my team to focus on the things that we know. I would say the things we know we can control. Let's try to keep our retention as high as possible for our donors and members. We know there's a lot of pivoting happening around public engagement, around K through 12 education. We might not have programs right this second yet as they're being developed to tie corporate sponsors to, but let's keep those corporate sponsors really engaged and really warm so they're ready to go. I would say for us, from a foundation fundraising perspective, we've never been busier. The person who manages our foundation giving is phenomenal and has been writing incredible grants, and we've seen just really really amazing transformative grants coming in from foundations. So I think that's a really interesting thing for our organization, where we have had this long-term commitment to racial equity, that foundations are saying, wow, you actually, like, we can invest in you in a way that might actually have field implications down the road. So we're really trying to look at it that way. And I'm also trying to ask my colleagues, how can we, in this moment when we're talking around decentralizing power, looking at the hierarchical nature of museums, how can we decentralize the accountability on fundraising to just sit with a few people? And I think that that's really important, because if you think about, the way that that many museums are structured, and arts organizations are structured, where the power is close to the money. Well, if more people have some accountability in that, then that power is shared by that nature. And also, it's a lot of pressure. I mean, we're a fundraising team of 12. So, and, I would say fundamentally right now, what we're trying to do is keep people employed. And so that's a lot of pressure on a small group of people. And I think this is an opportunity to kind of think about how it might, I don't have the answer yet, but how it might look different if more people share some of the accountability around fundraising across the organization.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Rehana, and I think a lot of my clients are using this opportunity, and you and I talked about this a few weeks ago, to educate the staff about what does the funding model really look like, and not just the advancement staff and the finance staff. And I think helping people understand what it looks like and how they can, as important engaged members of your community, be part of that success is a real opportunity right now as well.
Right. And I'll say, for as an example, in these anti-racist design teams that we're working in, there's really great questions coming from staff out of that around, how does the museum tick? Who are these board members? How do they board members? What do they do?
How are they chosen?
Right. And I'll give you an example, though. The other day I had a question of, there was an assumption that docents have a lot of power because they're really big donors. And so it was, well, how big of donors are they really? So I did the math quickly, and our docents contribute 2% of our annual fundraising total, 2%. So docents don't have a lot of power because they're the biggest donors. There's other reasons there. So it's just interesting because there's a lot of assumptions that this process is uncovering that I think is really fantastic in terms of helping the organization, the members of our organization, have a deeper understanding of sort of what I would call the business of being a museum. If the dollars come in, then the dollars go out. And how exactly does that look? And how are those choices made? And also, what are those things on the other side? If you say, we're not going to take money from certain corporations because they don't align with our values, we also have to have the conversation around the other side of the equation of what are we willing to let go of then? No one ever wants to talk about that part. And the answer isn't just go find more money, because we all know if that was easy, we would have done it already. So it's really rich and complex conversations that we're having with staff members who've never really been involved in this kind of conversation. And I think the organization will come out the better for it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the more diverse in every way we have a group of people thinking about these problems, the more robust our answers will be.
Absolutely.
Abbey, how would you address this question?
Gosh, I think Rehana opened her comments by talking with some reference of the things you can control. And that's just a shrinking list of things, incredibly. So I would say, I think that in general, just when the words pressure on philanthropy really come from a lot of different angles. And one of those angles, does have to do with power and influence. So I think that making sure that we continue to work with our board on accepting the mantle of responsibility for philanthropy is a pretty key point. And for our board to understand, accept, acknowledge, and make changes, that they have taken this on themselves. It's not our doing, but that what they look like matters to philanthropists, it matters to mission, etc. So in terms of how we balance our own priorities, what are the things that we're in control of, or areas where we can be effective? We all long for these moments when we can do cleanup of our tracking and our ratings and our assignments and our new prospect identification. We're trying to do that. We did just recently take on a planned gift survey that was much more widely received and responded to than I think we had ever anticipated. And for us to walk away with almost a 10% yield rate of qualified, solid prospects to us was really quite wonderful, and we'll be able to act on that. Supporting the board in its effort to identify prospects for nominating and governance, working with our colleagues to better understand how philanthropy works and to dispel assumptions about the kinds of conversations we have and with whom. And I think that we also are cleaning up, continue to clean up, refine our campaign case. It needs, by now it definitely needs some refinement. Shovels are about to go in the ground. So really having, I hate to call it the luxury of time, but we do have a little more breathing room to focus in on some of those issues and new prospect identification. So that's what we're doing to try to stay effective and to keep moving in the right direction.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for this really interesting conversation. I feel like we could have gone on for hours, and I do think we're going to have a reprise to find out what happened with some of the interesting things you all brought up. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. We hope that you will continue to participate in our webinars and check out our thought leadership on our website. If you haven't already, I invite you to connect with me and the firm on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions or want to talk about the topics that were raised today, please reach out to me or one of my colleagues. We hope you have a wonderful week. And again, thank you so much for joining us.